Welcome to the November Schuman Talk. Our guest tonight is going to be Jonathan Chaplin, Dr. Jonathan Chaplin. He's the co-editor of a recently released book called The Future of Brexit Britain. And we're all wanting to find out where things are going to go. So I want to say welcome, Jonathan. And we're very glad to have you back on a Schuman Center activity. You're no stranger to the Schuman Center. You were the keynote speaker at the State of Europe Forum in 2016 here in Amsterdam. It was just weeks before the Brexit referendum. You gave an excellent talk on what is the EU for. And here's the report of that event. And we want to offer anybody who would like to get the ebook version of this and be able to read Jonathan's talk on what is the EU for. If you were to write to me at my email address, jeff@schumancenter.eu, jeff@schumancenter.eu, we'll send this to you. Now, Jonathan and I think the last time we were together was actually in Finland. We were sharing a platform there. But Jonathan is the former director of the Kirby Lang Center for Christian Ethics in Cambridge. He's also a member of the University of Cambridge Divinity Faculty, and he's the co-editor of a very significant volume called God in the EU and the EU. Now, this is quite an expensive book, unfortunately, because this was a book that really a lot more people needed to have read before we went into the whole Brexit issue. Jonathan and I also have something else in common. We are both married to Dutch women. And although he lives in England, I live here in the Netherlands. And both Jonathan and his wife are specialists in, have written also scholarly about Abraham Kuyper, whose centennial we are commemorating this week. He died exactly 100 years ago yesterday. And there was going to be a symposium here in Amsterdam at the Free University in a couple of weeks that Jonathan and his wife were coming across for to contribute. But unfortunately, COVID has changed their plans. Now, today also happens to be the 31st anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. How could we forget it? Unfortunately, we are forgetting some of these significant things. And we recognize that in these last 30 years, so much has happened that we had never imagined would happen. We're going to be addressing some of these issues tonight. But we want to also take a moment to reflect on the life of another man. I realize this is not a football match, but we do want to just pause to reflect on the passing away this weekend of Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was a former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth and who, like Abraham Kuyper, contributed so much to understanding the times in the light of biblical truth. He worked very hard on applying public theology to current issues. And I personally have devoured a number of his books, and his legacy will live on through his books. And I want to ask you, Jonathan, did you know him personally at all, and how has his writing inspired you?
Sadly, I never met him in person. Wish I had done, but I followed his work for a number of decades, read some of his books and a number of his articles, heard many of his radio broadcasts. He was a giant in many ways. He was a sort of towering public intellectual in British public life over the last 30 or so years. He was a man of great learning. He was a man of great humanity. A man of great wisdom and a man of great fluency, a rare combination of gifts in today's society. He was an Orthodox Jew, a leader of the Orthodox Jewish community in the UK, and always spoke out of those particular Jewish convictions, but did so with an ease and a winsomeness and a creativity that were really admirable and enviable. And so he will leave an enormous hole in British public life. In fact, I was reflecting in the last day or so on how many other comparable figures there are in the UK now. So that is prominent religious public intellectuals who have that capacity to speak authentically and evocatively into the public square, it's quite a small number. You know, it would include a few individuals like former Archbishop Rowan Williams. Some of you will know his work, of course, who was brilliant in many ways, little abstruse and inaccessible for some, but Jonathan Sacks was always accessible and pertinent. And just this morning I heard played his final thought for the day, which is a 3-minute broadcast during the morning news program on BBC. And it was an absolutely masterful retelling of the story of Naomi, showing tremendous command of the text itself, and yet yielding from it a very powerful contemporary moral message that everybody could recognize. So yes, we will miss him greatly.
Yes, he's been one of these people who challenge us evangelicals to realize how much we can learn from listening to other traditions. And of course, this weekend, so much has happened. The outcome of the American elections has actually a lot to do with our topic today on the future of Brexit Britain. And it was back in 2016 when Lord Sacks wrote these prescient words, and we could see this slide. This is not politics as usual. The American presidential election, the Brexit vote, and the rise of extremism in the politics of the West are warnings of something larger, and the sooner we realize it, the better. What we are witnessing is the birth of a new politics of anger. It is potentially very dangerous indeed. No civilization lasts forever. The first sign of breakdown is that people stop trusting the ruling elite. That happened in both Washington and Westminster. Anger, he said, never solves problems. This is the next slide. It merely inflames them. The danger down the road, as it has been throughout history, is the demand for authoritarian leadership, which is the beginning of the end of the free society. We should not forget Plato's warnings that democracy can end in tyranny. There's only one viable alternative. It's not a return to the status quo. It's bigger than traditional divisions between the parties. It's the creation of a new politics of hope. And that was the title of the first book, I think, that I read of Jonathan Sacks, was The Politics of Hope. So I think we'll be continuing to draw from his well, as it were, the wisdom of that comes to us via the Old Testament. And of course, as Christians, we stand on the revelation through the Old Testament as well. Now, we call these talks the Schuman talks because we're also in conversation with Robert Schuman on various topics. We hold these events on the 9th of the month, and we start at 6 o'clock to remember what I call the decisive moment of post-war Europe. That was May the 9th, 1950, where Robert Schuman called a press conference and there surprised the world by announcing a plan for France and Germany to work together as equals on coal and steel production. This was the beginning of the European coal and steel community, which Italy also joined along with the Benelux countries. And this was the beginning of the project, the European project that eventually has led, for better or for worse, to the European Union as it is today. And in the only book that he ever wrote, which is this little book, you can get it for €5 from the Robert Schuman Foundation. Don't confuse that with the European Center for the Schuman Center for European Studies. But in this little book, which is really even though he had his own library of 8,000 books, this is all he actually produced in book form. He actually has a chapter that really is dealing with the exceptional situation of England. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. And there he actually what he calls England, and for what the Dutch always call England, they really mean Britain. And that's one of the issues that Jonathan picks up in this book and his co-writers in this book on Brexit Britain. This is what, way back in the 1960s, Robert Schuman said, European integration may win England's, and he meant Britain's, kindly benediction, but the constraint of events alone seems likely to force it into adhering to it. Now, that's what happened when Britain realized it was lagging behind economically. And of course, Monsieur Non, Charles de Gaulle, was out of the way. Then Britain did join, but it was not there at the start. And he also said England, and he meant Britain, manages to keep its distance from everything. It observes, this is the next slide, it observes without being isolated. Integration is like forced entry into their home, a serious kind of indiscretion. Okay, it's taken us quite these last 10 minutes then to actually get to the subject, which is this book co-edited by Jonathan. And the first thing I want to ask Jonathan is, when we look at the design of this cover, it's kind of intriguing because Britain is made up of passport stamps from all other countries. There's Big Ben and the Parliament buildings just down here. Let me see here. Yeah, that's the only British aspect on this cover. And I just wondered, well, was there a statement being made here, Jonathan? It was an intriguing cover.
Yes, it was. First, let me just say thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to work with you, Jeff, and Cedric and others through the Schuman Centre over a number of years. And I think you're doing some excellent work.
Thank you.
So, but yes, the story about the cover, that was entirely the publisher's design. And I don't think they had any particular agenda at all. This was just a creative graphic designer who came up with it. Personally, I was absolutely delighted with it, precisely for the reason that you point out, because it visually symbolizes the fact that Britain is profoundly impregnated and has been impacted over many, many centuries, millennia, by all things European. And that is not going to change. So no. We are integrally, historically, culturally, deeply, religiously European, as well as connected politically and economically. So I was very happy with that design. I didn't have any protest from contributors to the book who were on the other side of the Brexit debate. So we seem to have struck gold there. Just one little idiosyncratic detail that you might want to pay attention to. If you can possibly show the cover up again. On the first design, just raise it just a little higher. Yeah, on the first design, the designer accidentally left off part of Wales, which is called Anglesey. That is a small island on the top left of Wales. That's right, yeah. And so our Welsh contributor immediately shot back and said, "You will not get away with that. You'll sell no copies in Wales if you leave off Anglesey." And then, having done that, we then referred it to others, and we discovered that the contributor from the Isle of Wight also protested against the omission of the Isle of Wight. It's a small island at the bottom of England. So, territory in the United Kingdom is controversial. And
now, the Isle of Man, is that part of Great Britain?
The Isle of Wight, yes, absolutely.
No, the Isle of Man, that's not on here, but is that part of Great Britain?
Well, that's a long story. It's treated as such, but it has its own autonomy.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's fascinating. Yes. Well, tell me, Jonathan, was this your initiative, your idea, or how did this book come into being? And what did you hope to achieve by it?
So really, you could say that the book was born out of silence. That is the official silence of the Church of England throughout the entire Brexit process. The book actually came to birth out of a conference on faith and democracy about a year ago that was actually held at Lambeth Palace, which is the headquarters of the Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the Church of England. And during that conference, inevitably, the debate turned to Brexit, and conversations developed from that, in which people had observed that the Church of England had maintained this curious silence throughout the whole process. And I began talking to various people, a couple of bishops and various other people, and eventually my co-editor, Andrew Bradstock. And we resolved that this was a silence that needed to be filled. So the Church of England is, as many people know, legally the established church of England. It has this
Not
curious
Britain, but
status in
England.
the United
Mhm.
Kingdom. It's only the Church of England. It's England's national church, but it is also the only church in the United Kingdom that has constitutional status. And the Church of England likes to see itself as a national forum, a sounding board and an arena for large-scale national debates. And often it contributes to national debates, sometimes through the individual voices of its bishops, and other times through the House of Bishops collectively, or through General Synod, its chief governing bodies. And while a number of individual bishops did speak up on Brexit during the debate between 2015 and so forth, the Church of England itself made no official statement. This in spite of the fact that just a year earlier, this is 2015, the House of Bishops had managed to put together a 70-paragraph intervention before the general election. So
Well, the point, yeah, go on.
Well, just to say, this struck several of us as curious and
Yes.
in need of explanation, but also in need of response. And so the book really was born out of that silence, and it was an attempt to gather a wide range of Anglican views from right across the spectrum, lay, clerical, from all four nations of the UK, men and women, and so forth, in order to at least put something on the table by way of a discussion starter as to how theology might speak to Brexit.
But the point is made in the book that had the church come out with a statement choosing one side or another, it would have alienated a large proportion of its own membership and would not be in the position of being a bridge building, reconciling influence as it can be now, which I assume is part of the hope of this book.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And that, I think, was a leading reason why the House of Bishops collectively decided not to intervene. Indeed, it was a clear decision not to intervene, as one of our chapters reports. It was not just a neglect. And there is wisdom in that. I mean, I can see that it would have been difficult and damaging for the House of Bishops to come out definitively on one side of the debate or the other. Now, other churches in the UK did do so. The church in Wales, which is also Anglican, came out in favour of Remain. The Scottish Episcopal Church, which is the Anglican Church in Scotland, also came out in favour of Remain, and the Church of Scotland, which is a Presbyterian church and which is the nearest thing to an established church in Scotland, also came out in favour of Remain. But England was different. The church there was much, much more divided. The nation was much more divided. What some of us, I think, hoped for, or had hoped for, is that the bishops and others would not have simply come out with a prescription one way or the other, but a theological diagnosis of what had brought us to that place.
Yeah.
A reading of the signs of the times. And that, I think, is what many of us felt was lacking at the time.
Yes, I think Bonhoeffer would have had something to say about this, because he faced the question, should the church speak out against Hitler? And he's quite clear about where the limit of the church is to be placed. But Christians can speak out as Christians, but not as the church. Or you could say as the body of Christ. Yes, we are to be involved, but not as the formal church. But to preach the gospel, that is to explain the principles, the values by which people can make the decisions. And and in the book it talks about a confessional issue or a secondary theological issue. This is not a confessional. I mean, you don't lose your salvation if you choose for the wrong side, you know. And so in that sense, that was the argument used. But as you say, the same-sex issue was also not a confessional issue, and yet the church did come out with a statement on that. So there's no clear blueprint in Scripture. These are the things you can talk about. These are the things you can't talk about. It's part of applying public theology to the complexities of daily life, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, just to go back to Bonhoeffer, of course, Bonhoeffer did speak out through the Confessing Church, and especially in the Barman Declaration, in cooperation with Karl Barth, that was a very specific ecclesial intervention in politics against Nazism. The reason for that is because, and this is quite right, in Nazism, the state had overstepped its own mark by trespassing on the territory of faith, by becoming itself an object of idolatry among many sections of the German population, and cultivating that kind of idolatry. So in that case, of course, Bonhoeffer quite rightly, and to his own cost, of course, led an ecclesial stance of opposition to Nazism, which is the right thing to do. But you're quite right that Brexit was not obviously remotely an issue of that magnitude and order. It's interesting because in the book, there's a chapter by Malcolm Brown, who is one of the key players right at the heart of the Church of England on public affairs, explaining how the church came to this decision. And it draws that distinction that you did between confessional issues and issues on which it's legitimate for church members to take different views. That's quite right. I think others would say, as you hinted there, that hasn't stopped the Church of England making quite pointed and provocative and often divisive statements on non-confessional matters. And this, speaking personally, this is certainly something I would have said and did say at the time, that this is something which is of such national importance that a church which presumes to speak to the nation and be a national church ought to have some theological wisdom on, even if it didn't come down on one side or the other. In fact, it's interesting. Just days before the referendum, middle of June 2016, the Council of European Churches that you will know about and others, no doubt, participating will have heard of, issued a substantial statement on the EU, offering theological and ethical reflections, offering a positive faith-based vision of the EU, with which I have considerable sympathy, in fact. But of course, that was days before the referendum, far too late to make any difference. And it sank without trace in the UK, sadly.
Well, Jonathan, as a political theologian, am I correct in calling you a political theologian? That's one of your specialties. Can you comment on where is the dividing line for churches to be involved in politics? Because we've just watched the situation in America, and it seems to me that so many churches stepped over the line and have muddied the situation and caused much more polarization than was necessary. What's your perspective on that?
Well, the desire for what you call the bright line, that is a clear, consistent, and, as it were, unchanging boundary around the church's public pronouncements, is itself somewhat misplaced. I mean, history, society is much messier than that. So much of this is contextual. In certain contexts, such as Germany in the 1930s, South Africa in the 1970s, 80s, and forth, it was an absolute mandate for churches to speak out against a grotesque injustice and oppression that was taking place. And many of them did, rightly so. So in a sense, that's clear. We would all agree, I think, that the church
speaking to the issues,
has an obligation to speak in those settings and many, many other parallel settings around the world, including today. When it comes to adopting partisan strategies, that is, lining up with one specific political party on questions which are deeply polarizing and contested, then of course it's problematic. It's on the whole, churches should refrain from doing that. That's churches as organized institutions, so to speak. But of course, there are many other ways that Christians can make their voices heard. Nobody will need reminding that for decades, Christian democratic parties, among others, in Europe have been a principal vehicle for lay people to participate in politics from the standpoint of a Christian perspective. They haven't always done it very well. In fact, lately, I think they've done it quite badly in many European countries. But nonetheless, this is an alternative vehicle, say, for the church in the broadest sense, including Christians in their roles as citizens, members of nation states and so forth, to speak in a way which can be much more particular and indeed partisan. Needn't be through a political party. It could be through a campaigning organization, an NGO, a think tank, a mass movement, a social network. There are all sorts of avenues outside the formal channels of the institutional church, whereby lay people, lay Christians, have and should be able to and should engage in political activity and outspoken political speech. And Christians, generally speaking, certainly in Britain, are cultivated to often avoid offence and avoid position taking, and that can be an inhibition because we follow a prophet from Nazareth who routinely offended, divided, and challenged oppressive establishments. So we have to find creative ways through these and other ways, beyond those that I've mentioned, to bring prophetic, critical voices to bear in the public square, in politics and civil society, in which we authentically convey what we are deeply convinced are the claims of the gospel on public life. These are not simple questions. These require careful communal discernment. We're very often think individualistically. That's very much a British idea. But I'm sure it's present in many other countries too, that individuals are somehow entitled to sovereignly decide their own stances in complete indifference to the rest of the body of Christ. That is not being the church. That's being a collective.
Yeah.
On the evangelical embrace of the new right of the religious right in the US and particularly Trump, I mean, one needs to introduce another layer of analysis there. So this is not just about drawing a line between and what the church may not say, because in fact most of the time, those supporting Trump are not necessarily official churches. They are networks. Hundreds of thousands of members, tens of millions of dollars behind them, mass lay movements, which in principle fall within the category of lay civil society movements that I've just praised. So one has to look not just at this conveyed, but the content of that witness. And in my view, as I'm sure many of our listeners today, what we're selling of the soul of the evangelical movement in the USA, hitching their wagon to a monstrous leader who has no sense of the values of the gospel, and charging into this project blindly, sincerely, very often, with some good motives and good intentions, no doubt, but in a way which I think has left that movement deeply sullied and tainted for a whole generation. So there's an enormous amount of work to do there for evangelicals in the USA. A lot more to say on that, but
so it's widely accepted the separation between church and state, at least in the West, but that is not to say that religion and politics or Christianity and politics have nothing to do with each other, because anybody who really knows an understanding of the development of Western politics and Western democracy would not have happened without the gospel. However, coming back to this book here, the three main things you're trying to say in this book have to do with what?
Yes.
You're actually wanting to focus on the nation, and then Europe, and then the role of the body of Christ, right? Can you expound that a bit more?
those are the three aims that we set out in the introduction, that we invited our contributors to speak to. And let me repeat that the contributors come from right across the spectrum. Perhaps I should add a footnote here that in a sense, I'm wearing two hats now. I'm wearing my hat as co-editor of this book, which requires me to take a certain distance and adopt a certain objectivity towards its contents. So it covers the entire spectrum from absolutely committed Brexiteers to absolutely passionate Remainers, such as myself. But I'm also a contributor to the book, and I'm an unrepentant and passionate Remainer for what I hope are Christian reasons. So you'll hear both those voices here. But yes, the three objectives of the book. Firstly, to ask the question, how should we reflect theologically as churches on British national identity in the light of the fractures, the fissures, the sheer bad-temperedness and the deep divisions that Brexit has caused across the ideological spectrum within the UK, between the four nations of the UK, between different ethnic and racial communities in the UK, and so forth. How do we move forward as a British nation after this, what I would regard as a self-inflicted wound on our national culture, national identity? How do we begin to chart a course whereby the British nation can begin to understand itself in a new way in the post-Brexit situation? And what we try to do in the book is to ask not how can we maintain ancient historical, cultural customs and traditions and so forth, important though they are, but the way we put it is to say we understand identity as the moral and political commitments and visions that we will commit to in the future. That's what we asked our contributors to do, and there's a wide variety of answers to that. The second aim is...
Before you go on a second, you're talking here, the first thing you wanted to do was have a truthful look at the whole Brexit process and the nation. Now, when you talk about the British nation, you're bringing up something very, very complex. And the impression I got reading the book was, wow, this is a very healthy process that I don't think is going on anywhere else in Europe, that the British have a look at themselves. Now, this is an Anglican look. It's not the full Christian spectrum, but this is a first catalyst. But even the depth and the breadth of it spoke to me about the fact that here is a very good look at who we are and why we're in this situation that I don't think is going on. I guess Germany has gone through some of that type of thing. But that impressed me. Now, what were some of the complexities? Perhaps you want to get into this later, but there's no such thing really as a British nation, is there?
Well, that's a leading question. So Britain, there's the United Kingdom, there's Britain, and there's England, alongside Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It is a highly complex community of nations. I wouldn't go so far as to say that there is no such thing as the British nation or British national identity. There certainly is. It's about 300 years old, you could say. It's highly disputed what it amounts to. It's impossible to summarize. This is true of any nation. You can't summarize a nation's identity on the back of a postcard in a series of 4 or 5 bullet points. These are our core values, so to speak. British governments have been trying to do that for 20 years, and all they've been able to come up with, this is official, is 4 values, which are key British values, which will be entirely familiar to everybody listening: the rule of law, freedom, democracy, and toleration. Well, those are hugely important, and we desperately need to protect all of them today, of course, but they're not uniquely British in any sense whatsoever. They're shared by almost all European countries today, and many other countries too. So British governments have failed miserably in attempting to come up with any official account of what British national identity amounts to. It can't be done in that superficial way. The only way you can do that is by telling a story, is by thick description, relating a narrative of how what we now call Britain, with its 4 constituent nations, came to be. And of course, professional historians are attempting to do that all the time. Many of them disagree. That's fine. There needs to be at some point, I think in every nation, not just Britain, some forum which is separate from government. We don't want government's hands anywhere near it, frankly. A civic forum in which multiple narrative accounts of national identity can get a hearing, so that out of that could emerge some sort of recognition of a shared story, even though it will inevitably be given different accents by different members of the community, and a recognition of the incurable plurality and diversity of those stories, and that somehow we have to come to a point of living comfortably with those different stories and finding a way, as Jonathan Sacks put it in the title of his book, to build a home together in spite of those differences. Now, in Britain, it's complicated because we have the 4 nations. I think it's probably fair to say that, well, it's undoubtedly true to say that what drove Brexit was anxiety and perceived threat to English national identity. Of course, Wales voted for Brexit as well by a small majority, but less, I think, so because of issues regarding Welsh identity. Scotland voted for Remain, and so did Northern Ireland. So this is primarily an English problem, and it's one which I think the churches ought to have been able to, and still might be able to, say something insightful on. Some larger perspective, some deeper perspective, which might allow these kinds of debates to take place before we fall apart. And that is a real danger now in the light of Brexit.
Yeah. So the first section is really trying to take stock of the nation. What nation do we want? The second section, can you explain to us what the second aim and the third aims were?
Okay, so there are 3 aims of the book, but the aims run through all the different parts of the book. So they transcend the 5 parts. So the second one is how, in the light of leaving Brexit, do we see our future relationship with the rest of Europe, and including the EU, of course. So now that we're no longer present in the institutions of the EU, we're an independent country, self-governing country, as Brexiteers like to describe us, we have some choices to make. We can decide what the future relationship with Europe will be, what it will be with the USA, what it will be with other nations and regions of the world. Now, we don't have complete freedom of choice. We are highly constrained in those choices. But nonetheless, there is a window of opportunity to reset our role in the world. And this is indeed a unique opportunity, even though it's one I regret that we're in the situation of having. We have to make the best of it. And so that question, how, assuming that the book assumes that we have an obligation of solidarity to our European neighbors, indeed to all nations, but particularly to our European neighbors with whom we are so closely bound up. And so that question asks, what form will solidarity take, even if we're outside the EU? We don't pose the question of whether we should think of rejoining. That's a future generations question, which we don't address. And again, you get a variety of views in the book. There are some who, on the Brexit side, want to, as it were, leave the EU to its own devices, take distance from it, and explore this concept of a global Britain. I have my questions about that, but there are some articulate defenders of that in the book. Primarily, that means a renewed Atlanticism, in which we will attempt to renew our so-called special relationship with the USA. Not going so well at the moment. We'll come back to that later, perhaps. And others, such as myself and several others, who urge Britain to maintain deep connections to Europe in general, but also the EU as a political institution, and to make it work to its best capacity, even though we're no longer part of it. And certainly that would be my view. We're not going to have a place at the table around the EU. We've chosen to absent ourselves, so we can't expect to be taken with anything like the same seriousness. But in whatever ways we can, we need to make the EU, this is my view now, so contributor, not editor speaking, we need to make the EU succeed. And it's failing badly in so many ways. It needs all the help it can get, even from Britain, if I can put that rather presumptuously. You know, there are people within Britain, organizations in Britain, groups of thought in Britain, who will have something to say about the EU. I hope the churches will too. You know, in the EU's welfare is our welfare, to quote that famous passage from Jeremiah.
Yeah. If I can bring Robert Schuman back in here, this was the question he had concerning Germany as a Frenchman. What does it mean to love our neighbor? Now, as evangelicals and Protestants, we tend to think very individualistically, but Catholics can think much more corporately and as nations. And so how do nations love our neighbors? Now, the question you are raising for the church in Britain, the obvious question needs to be asked by us in Europe, or I should say in non-British EU, is what is our Christian responsibility of solidarity towards the British? Of course, Britain is not leaving Europe, it's leaving the European Union, which is a very different thing. I wonder, Cedric, if you could bring up the second quote, which starts with "my hope," which Jonathan finishes, no, the next one. Jonathan finishes his talk with, "my hope." Yeah, this one here. Perhaps, Jonathan, you could read that and explain what you're saying. I'm sorry, I see a typo there.
Yeah, so this is what I say in my chapter. So I'm speaking here as the contributor rather than the editor. It is that Britain will rise again to the challenge of European solidarity and fulfill its potential as a nation with much to offer to the future of Europe, albeit for the foreseeable future from the diminished platform of a third country absent from the EU's most powerful tables. That is certainly my hope. I think there are large numbers of people who would share that hope. And if I can anticipate a question that I think you might want to ask me later, non-British Europeans, to those outside, it is that. It is that 4 years you have seen what has been foregrounded before European eyes is a trend of English nationalism, which is now dominating the governing party of the UK, Conservative Party. But this is not the whole of Britain. You will know this, but it's important to underline this. This, not exclusively, but particularly in England. You know, the debate, the reference was very marginal. It was a difference of less than 4%. And since then, opinion polls suggest that you know, a number of people regret leaving, are very uncertain about the future of Britain outside the EU. Many people care greatly about maintaining healthy, productive, cooperative relationships with the EU. So that is still my grounds for that hope. And although, you know, this won't bear fruit for the future, this is going to be a slow burn. I would encourage, you know, Europeans and other countries to for those signs and those evidences of sustained solidarity with Europe that exist in Britain, because they're very many. I'm not just talking about the university sector, where it's very strongly pro EU, but in many other parts of the business community, trade union movement, many civil society organizations, many religious communities as well. So
No.
that may not mean rejoining in my lifetime, but we need to think in terms of maintaining, deepening, and exploiting those deep ties over the next generation, so that, well, for the benefit of both sides, frankly, because we are in a dangerous fracturing world in which new superpowers are emerging who do not have our interests at heart, to put it mildly. Russia, China, and so forth. And therefore we need to maintain that very strong bond with Europe, whatever form it takes.
Yeah. Now, the third thing that we'll move on to eventually is, what contribution does the church make to all of this? But before we do so, help us understand a little bit of the turmoil that was going on inside Britain. There's several places refer to a book by David Goodhart, The Road to Somewhere. That's that first quote, Cedric, if you could bring that up, and then we'll talk about the 4Ds. Yeah, The Road to Somewhere. What is this concept that... that's the fundamental fault line in UK politics. Could you explain this a little bit?
Yes, so this is a thesis propounded by David Goodhart, which resonated with a number of contributors to our book on both sides of the Brexit debate. And so his fundamental distinction, his fundamental explanation for Brexit is that it is a local British symptom of what is a global phenomenon produced by extensive globalization over the last 20, 30, 40 years, in which, and he documents this primarily in relation to Britain, but it is a Europe-wide phenomena. The population is divided into three categories. There are the anywheres, there are the somewheres, and then there are the remainder. So the anywheres are people like me, who have relatively high levels of education, have moved around. I married a foreigner very happily. I don't live in my hometown, which is near Manchester. I rarely go back there. So anywheres are those who are, as it were, mobile, educated, and have considerable clout in the emerging knowledge economy. They don't have strong and intense feelings of patriotism. They often regard themselves as citizens of the world. By contrast, the somewheres are, maybe 50% of the population, Goodhart estimates, who generally still live within striking distance of the place where they were born. They value that place. They tend to be less mobile because they're economically less, have fewer opportunities to travel and move around. They live in small towns, in rural areas. They regard globalization as a threat rather than an opportunity. And they have often felt, justifiably so in many cases, overlooked in the national conversation, to put it mildly. Indeed, patronized, sometimes ridiculed, and belittled. And they feel democratically disenfranchised. Globalization, nobody asked them whether globalization should take place. They tried to live their lives in the way that they could, and they ended up feeling marginalized or unheard. Not necessarily economically poor, I should stress that, but those who were not part of the national conversation. That's Goodhart's distinction. And then the other 20%, 25% of those that don't fit into either category. It's not a comprehensive analysis, and there are problems with it. So, somebody like me, even though I don't live in my hometown, I still have strong emotional attachments to family who still live there. I have new attachments to the place I now live in. I feel I have multiple identities, from locality all the way to the European Union. So it's a rather simplistic set of categories, but it has evoked recognition among many people.
It certainly helps. Yeah. And Nicholas Townsend gives further dimension to the somewheres with his list of the 4Ds. Perhaps, Cedric, you can bring that up. He talks about distrust and deprivation and destruction and de-alignment. Do you want to comment on this?
Yes. So distrust, the point I was just making, that they don't feel they are in the national conversation anymore. I mean, just to give you a specific example, I think it was 2010. I'm not quite sure that it was 2010 or 2015. The general election, something like 13% of people voted for the United Kingdom Independence Party, which was a passionately pro-Brexit party. 12% of the population. Now, in any of our audience's parliamentary democracies, that would have meant that party would have had probably dozens of seats in Parliament. In Britain, it would have meant, if we'd had a system of proportional representation, there would have been 60, 70 Brexit MPs in the House of Commons. They won one seat. Now, that's just one symptom of how that kind of a voice is not recognized as part of the national conversation. The main political parties were simply not paying attention to that significant voice. Deprivation, a point I've made earlier, a significant number, not all, of somewhere are indeed educationally and economically less privileged than the anywheres. The term destruction, there's a sense that mass sudden immigration, particularly accentuated in the early 2000s, when the then Labour government essentially abandoned any attempt to moderate immigration at all, encouraged mass immigration, rather recklessly in hindsight, in terms of the pace and the inattention to how that took place, created this sense, perceived or whether real or perceived, of one's cultural identity being watered down, marginalized, and disrespected. Now, often this is a perception, a misperception, but nonetheless, it gained ground. And then finally, de-alignment, the fact that the conventional parties in Britain, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and the Liberal Democrats, did not provide those voices for people experiencing these perceptions, and therefore we had new parties emerging, the UKIP and the Brexit Party, a surge of support for the Scottish National Party, and so forth. So a disruption, in other words, to the standard, stable, conventional political wisdom of the time, and we're still dealing with that. We have to deal with those 4Ds in some way or another, and we've barely begun to.
Okay, so there's a whole national discussion going on that deals with how do we get to where we are now and who are we. Second thing you're trying to stimulate discussion on is how do we engage Europe faithfully? How do we show solidarity? Let's move on to the third, and that is, what is the role of the body of Christ in encouraging Britain to live beyond Brexit gracefully?
Yes, I mean, that's a theme that recurs throughout the book again, but there is a section of the book, part of the book, which crosses that head on. Again, a variety of views. Let me give you a sampling of some of the views. I'm experiencing a little bit of disruption here in the sound. I hope you can hear me okay.
It's all right, go on.
Okay, yeah. So on the one hand, those who favour Brexit are and have been very critical of the churches generally, particularly the Church of England, because even though it remained officially neutral, the majority of its leaders who did speak out spoke clearly in favour of the move, and some of them regretfully made derogatory comments about leaders, for which they had to apologise, frankly. And so for them, for Brexiteers, grace requires of apology and repentance on the part of church leaders who spoke rather contemptuously of those on the Leave side. That is a fair point. It is true, I think, that the church collectively and its leadership collectively did not heed those voices that I was just talking about. And it didn't voice their concerns. There were some exceptions. Indeed, the book is opened by the Anglican Bishop of Burnley, a post-industrial town in the north of England, which makes that exact point. So that's one of the views, that grace and reconciliation beyond Brexit does require an acknowledgement of the Church's failure to heed an important part of the national voice, and indeed the Church's own membership, 66% of whom voted Brexit. I say membership, I mean those who in polls self-identify as Anglican, which of course is way more than those who actually attend any church. And then there's and then on the other side, there are those who argue that, grace and reconciliation beyond Brexit can only take place in the context of renewed commitment to Europe, if not the EU. And they're less inclined to offer apologies for what went before. Although there is not a single contributor, I think, who does not admit that the Remain side in the Brexit debate was guilty of very serious failures. That is one interesting thing throughout the book. Nobody in the book claims that the Remain side in the national debate got it right. And I'm one of several who severely criticized the Remain side for reducing the issue to a question of economic transactionalism, economic net benefit, a utilitarian argument which was never going to sway people's hearts, indeed their minds. It was a chronic failure of, frankly, a remote political establishment that had a vested interest in membership of the EU and simply was not listening to that pulsating voice rising up in many quarters in the UK. There was no vision of moral solidarity projected by the Remain campaign, and that was a historic failure. And we will never be in a position in a future generation, let's say, to think about rejoining unless that moral vision of political and moral solidarity can somehow be formed in a significant part of the population. So then, in the middle of those two positions, there's a variety of different proposals. Several people hold out the hope that the churches generally, and some in particular the Church of England, because it still remains in some sense the national church, as a parish in every community, it is still looked to residually in some sense as the national church, still is capable of at least contributing to a national healing process. Most of those who hold that view say that this is going to be a modest contribution. It's largely going to be an invisible or local contribution. Nobody is expecting the Church of England to, as it were, be the white knight riding in to rescue the nation at its time of peril. That will be a fanciful idea. The Anglican Church is less and less publicly relevant anyway. The churches are less and less publicly relevant. So if my own view here is that if the Church of England and other churches are to play such a role, they have to be honest about what caused Brexit, confront those truths, difficult truths, have to be attentive to a wide variety of voices in helping to make sense of the past and hope for the future. Patient, it has to go through a listening exercise for a considerable period of time before it will be in a position to say something of any public significance. There are small initiatives already in that direction, but it's going to take time. Don't expect any large public initiatives for a considerable period of time. But the potential is there, and in my view, but that could involve multiple things. There isn't time to run through them all now. Let me just say that at the level of national leaderships, probably the best thing that could happen is over a number of years, churches get together ecumenically to offer the sort of diagnostic theological document that they should have produced in 2015. We still need that kind of theological reflection, focused internally on British national identity, but also externally on our relations with Europe. There is a place for that sort of document, not handed down on high from the bishops, but produced by a wide-ranging, multi-voice process that gathers up what wisdom the churches may yet have to offer on that.
So reconciliation is very much part of the vocabulary. Perhaps this is a good place to bring in the quote from the Bishop of the Diocese of Europe, Robert Innes, who is based in Holy Trinity in Brussels. Reconciliation is not just implied by the gospel, it is the gospel. And would you like to comment on John McDowell's statement there?
Yes, John McDowell was, when we invited him to write, he was the Bishop of Clogher, which was a diocese of the Anglican Church of Ireland that straddled the border between North and South. So he brought a unique voice, and editors shouldn't say this, but his is one of my favorite chapters in the book, actually. Since then, he was promoted to Primate of all Ireland, which is he's the senior church leader in the whole of the Anglican Church of Ireland.
Yes, which is called the Church of Ireland, isn't it?
Church of Ireland,
yes. The Church of Ireland, yes.
Which is Anglican.
Yeah.
So reconciliation, very interesting comment, is less a good to be pursued in its own right than it is a consequence of pursuing other goods like justice, peace, and the common good. I mean, both those statements are powerful and true. Reconciliation is not an afterthought of the gospel. I mean, in Paul's definition of the gospel, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, and we are the ambassadors of reconciliation. It's absolutely central to the gospel itself. It's not an add-on. It's not a consequence. It's constitutive of. So that's, I think, what Bishop Innes means, and he's doing that in exemplary ways from his platform as bishop in Europe. Yes, and John McDowell, I think, is absolutely correct that you don't set out, as it were, abstractly in a situation like ours after Brexit. You don't say, now we're going to launch a project of national reconciliation. That would be hopelessly implausible. What you do is you see reconciliation as a mid-term, long-term goal, and you do the deeds of justice, peace, and the common good, and many, many other things, building up communities, attending to neglected voices, working for racial and ethnic reconciliation on the ground in small ways and large ways, working through various political channels to advance the cause of justice, to respond to the needs of those who are genuinely marginalized economically, politically, and culturally, confronting questions of immigration and multiculturalism piece by piece. You do that over a generation. And then in time, if those go well, to the extent that they go well, then there could be some measures of healing or reconciliation further down the line. It's a messy, multi-pronged, largely local-based project that the churches need to commit themselves to. That I think there's great wisdom in what Archbishop John McDowell says on that score, and he knows, because he has worked and continues to work on the front line of the Northern Ireland conflict, which
absolutely
is far from over, as he would be the first to admit.
And of course, that border is one of the sticking points on the Brexit talks, and it seemed like things were really in a log jam. Has the election of Joe Biden made a difference?
Well, it undoubtedly will make a difference to the future progress of these talks. It's too early to say precisely how. We already have known for a long time that Joe Biden is a passionate Irishman. Like many Americans, is very proud of his Irish descent, however many generations back. And there are many people in Congress who would have to approve any trade deal with the UK who have stated very emphatically that they will not tolerate any derogation from the commitment to Northern Ireland and Ireland in the withdrawal agreement. So, as many of you, well, some of you may know, the government recently brought in a highly controversial bill, which is called the Internal Market Bill, which is designed to ensure that the economy between the four nations of the UK continues to function after December the 31st. And much of it is necessary. Much of it is nuts and bolts of commerce and trade and regulation and so forth. But includes in it a provision which quite explicitly, and the government acknowledges this, breaches the commitments made in the withdrawal agreement regarding the Irish border. Mm-hmm. And all I can say is that many people, including me, think this is a really outrageous breach of trust with the EU and with our closest neighbour, which is Ireland. Mm-hmm. And I would commend Ireland for its patience and restraint in this whole process. You know, we should have had we deserve more stick from Ireland than it's actually given us. So this is a serious failure, not only of international diplomacy, but more than that, this particular bill also allows the government essentially to override existing domestic law, bypassing Parliament. So it's doubly a breach of the principle of the rule of law. This is the very last thing we should be doing at this critical time. And you know, Biden and other American politicians have made very clear that if that has adverse consequences for Ireland, they will not tolerate any trade deal that is based on that breach. So Britain is in for a potentially very rough ride with the Biden administration on that point, which of course is the most important international issue at the moment is facing. On other issues, on COP26, climate change, on responding to Russia and China, on the World Health Organization, the global pandemic, you know, the arrival of the Biden administration can only massively help our cooperation with the US and with other nations too. And of course, like many, I'm breathing a massive sigh of relief at that outcome. But Britain should not think that it's going to be a smooth passage with the Biden administration.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. You've done a great job of giving us a glimpse of this book, and I hope you've given us enough, the listeners, enough to want to go and get this book and read it through and get the many-sided input on it, because it's not a straightforward topic at all. But I haven't read it from cover to cover, but what I have read has been very, very insightful for me. The perspectives from Wales, from Ireland, from Scotland that we don't often hear. And all too often we talk about England as if we mean the whole thing. And that makes us aware of the complexity. You are working on a new book now. When is that due and what will that be about?
So that's expected to appear around about April next year. Title is Faith in Democracy, Framing a Politics of Deep Diversity. Rather improbable offering faith in democracy at such a time, one might say. But it's an attempt to ask the question from a British perspective. It's focused principally on the UK, but has implications beyond, obviously, to other liberal democracies. What actually is the place of religious faith, indeed faith of any kind, deep commitment at the level of faith, in what we normally think of as a secular, neutral, liberal democracy. So it attempts to ask questions of what democracy actually means, and the first couple of chapters are to spell out a Christian account of democracy rooted in Christian political thought, which has some distinctive characteristics that set it off against standard secular liberal accounts. It then discusses issues of secularization, secularism, relations between religion and the state, religious freedom, and then tries to work these positions out in relation to issues of conscience in the public realm, issues of faith-based organizations, issues of religiously informed political speech in democratic settings, and the legitimacy of deploying political power for religious ends. And in that final chapter, well, I'll just throw this in. I have a number of examples. One of them is what's called Project Blitz. This is something that predates Donald Trump, but it's part of the American religious right. It's a fascinating and disturbing initiative whereby a number of very powerful and wealthy, corporately funded Christian evangelical organizations are attempting to sponsor so-called Christian legislation in state legislatures across the USA. And although there are some aspects of it that I can understand and agree with, fundamentally, I think it's a problematic example of how Christians should be deploying political power. Then I have a section on Christian democracy, which is much more positive, and sections on how Muslims, and then in Britain, sections on how Muslims are engaging in society and politics in very creative ways, attempting there to tell a different story to the master narrative of much of the media, which is almost exclusively concerned with segregation and extremism and violence for understandable reasons. And then on Christianity. So that's the sort of sweep of the book, and it'll be out.
So there's Faith in Democracy, SCM, is that right? The publisher, SCM?
Yes, SCM, yeah.
Okay, Faith and Democracy. And coming back to Abraham Kuyper, you and your wife have been contributing to a compendium that is coming out as a centennial publication by IVP in America. Do you know what that book will be called?
No, you've caught me on the hop here. I should have checked.
Okay.
I've just forgotten the title.
All right. We'll watch out for it.
Yeah, if you look at the name Robert Joustra, Abraham Kuyper, you'll come across it, IVP.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, it's been so fascinating. We'd just love to continue to pick your brain, but fortunately, you put a lot of material in this book that we can draw from, and you've given us something to look forward to in the book Faith in Democracy, coming out in April. Well, that's it for tonight, and next month we'll be with you again on December the 9th at 6 o'clock, and we invite you to join us. Thank you very much indeed.